Let us turn our attention to the idea of financial stability. In economies of the past, trust in money and public borrowing could often be uncertain. A government's promise to repay a loan was not always seen as a guarantee. This uncertainty made it difficult to manage national finances. To address this, a new kind of institution slowly took shape: a central bank. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, provides a clear early example. Its creation was a practical solution to a specific problem. The English government needed to borrow a large sum of money, but it struggled to find lenders who had confidence in its ability to repay. A group of merchants proposed a new arrangement. They would form a bank and lend the required funds to the government. In return, this new bank was granted a unique privilege: the right to issue its own banknotes. These banknotes were essentially paper promises, redeemable for gold or silver. Because the Bank of England was also the government's official banker, its notes carried a special weight. Public confidence in them grew steadily. People began to accept and use these notes as a reliable form of currency for everyday trade. At the same time, the bank established a more orderly and predictable system for government borrowing. Lenders had more confidence, knowing a stable institution was managing the process. This quality is known as credibility. Credibility is simply a measure of trustworthiness. So this central institution helped create stability in two key ways. First, it managed the government's debt, making public finance more reliable. Second, its banknotes provided a trusted and uniform currency. The financial system now had a dependable anchor. It established a firm foundation for both the currency and for public trust. This model of a central authority, designed to foster stability and credibility, would eventually be adopted and adapted around the world. The core ideas of reliability and confidence were given a permanent institutional home, a quiet center for the flow of finance, a place for the system to rest. As trade networks slowly expanded, a more standardized solution to the problems of barter began to appear: coinage. Coins, typically made from precious metals like silver and gold, offered a consistent and portable measure of value. They solved the problem of finding someone who wanted exactly what you had to offer. For local transactions, this was a significant improvement. However, for the long-distance merchant, this physical form of money introduced its own set of quiet, practical challenges. The most immediate of these was the simple physical burden of wealth. A merchant undertaking a major journey to purchase goods like wool or timber was not carrying a small purse for daily expenses. They were transporting their capital. This meant carrying heavy sacks, or even sturdy wooden chests, filled with hundreds or thousands of metal coins. This wealth had a tangible mass, a weight that had to be loaded onto pack animals or secured in a cart, taking up valuable space. The journey itself was slow, and the steady weight of the coins was a constant physical reminder of the value being moved from one place to another. The routes these merchants traveled were often long and isolated. The roads connecting towns and cities were not always well maintained or frequently patrolled. Traveling with a large, visible quantity of gold or silver presented a logistical concern. The risk of being targeted by thieves was a simple reality of the journey, a practical problem that required planning. To manage this, merchants often banded together, forming caravans for safety in numbers. Others might hire guards to accompany their cargo, adding a significant cost to the expedition. Furthermore, the world of coinage was not uniform. Different regions, cities, and kingdoms minted their own currency. A silver coin from one port might have a different weight or purity than a coin from another. This meant that upon arriving at a new destination, a merchant's first task was often to find a money changer. This was a careful process of having their coins weighed, assessed, and exchanged for the local currency, adding another layer of complexity and potential cost to every long-distance transaction. So while coinage was a step forward, it transformed the challenges of trade rather than eliminating them. The burden shifted from bartering bulky goods to transporting and securing heavy, valuable metal. The physical weight of the coins, the slow and uncertain nature of travel, and the complexity of multiple currencies all created a persistent need. It was a need for a way to represent and transfer value without having to physically carry the gold and silver itself over every mile. Before the widespread use of metal coins, the concept of money was tied to things of immediate, tangible value. In early agricultural societies, wealth was measured by what the land and its animals could produce. Two of the most important of these were grain and livestock. These fundamental resources became the first, rudimentary forms of currency, used to store value, facilitate trade, and manage economic life in a very direct way. In ancient civilizations like Mesopotamia and Egypt, grain, particularly barley, was a cornerstone of the economy. A harvest surplus was the community's primary form of wealth. Large, centrally managed granaries, often connected to temples or palaces, served as safe storage facilities. A farmer could deposit their excess barley and, in return, receive a receipt. This receipt was frequently a small clay tablet, carefully inscribed with the amount of grain stored. This simple token represented a specific quantity of a valuable commodity. It could then be used to pay taxes, settle debts, or trade with a craftsperson for a new tool. The recipient of the tablet could, in turn, present it at the granary to claim their allotted portion of grain. The physical grain remained safely stored while its value circulated in the form of these clay receipts. Alongside grain, livestock served as another common form of early money. The wealth of a family or a leader was often counted in heads of cattle, sheep, or goats. Animals were a mobile and self-reproducing asset. Their value was clear and understood by all. In fact, the Latin word for money, pecunia, is derived from *pecus, the word for cattle, showing how deeply this connection was ingrained. However, livestock had its limitations. An animal could not be easily divided for a small purchase, and it required constant care and pasture. So these early forms of money were deeply connected to the rhythms of agriculture. Grain served as a divisible unit of account, ideal for record-keeping and everyday payments through the use of receipts. Livestock represented a larger, more durable but less flexible store of wealth. These systems, based on the essential goods of life, provided a stable foundation for economic activity long before the first metal coin was ever struck. They were a quiet, practical first step in separating the idea of value from a simple, direct exchange of goods. While useful within a community, currencies based on grain and livestock had their inherent limitations. Grain could spoil, and its value could fluctuate dramatically between a good harvest and a poor one. Livestock was durable but was not easily divisible for smaller transactions. As trade routes lengthened and economic activity grew more complex, there was a quiet, practical search for a medium of exchange that was more stable, portable, and universally accepted. This search led, in many parts of the world, to precious metals. Gold, silver, and to a lesser extent copper, possessed a unique set of qualities. They did not rust or decay, meaning they could store value indefinitely. They were also dense, so a small amount could represent a significant value, making them far more portable than sacks of grain. Critically, these metals could be melted and divided into smaller units, or combined into larger ones, without losing their intrinsic worth. In the beginning, these metals were not used as stamped coins. Instead, a merchant might carry small bags of silver dust, carefully cut pieces of a silver bar, or even simple rings of gold. When a payment was needed, the process was deliberate and precise. The merchant would produce a small, portable balance scale. Bits of metal would be placed on one side until they perfectly balanced a set of standardized weights on the other. This act of weighing was a routine and essential part of commerce. In this way, precious metals provided a more consistent and reliable answer to the needs of growing trade. Their value was based on weight and purity, something that could be verified anywhere. They were durable, easily carried, and could be divided to suit the size of any transaction. But this reliance on raw metal and scales carried its own inconvenience. The constant need to weigh every payment and assess the purity of the metal created a slow, methodical pace. It was a dependable system, but one that held within it the potential for an even simpler, more standardized form. With the establishment of coinage, the mechanics of trade became more fluid, but the fundamental challenges of distance remained. For the medieval merchant, undertaking a long journey was a significant enterprise, filled with a quiet set of inherent risks that were simply a part of the work. These were not sudden dangers, so much as they were predictable logistical hurdles that had to be carefully managed. The entire venture from start to finish was a slow and deliberate process. A merchant preparing for a sea voyage, for instance, faced numerous uncertainties. The ships of the era were sturdy, but they were still vulnerable to the unpredictability of weather. A journey that was expected to take 2 months could easily take 3, consuming precious supplies. There was the constant, low-level risk of piracy on certain routes, and the simple possibility of cargo being damaged by water or shifting in a storm. These were considered costs of doing business, factored into the final price of the goods. The merchant's capital, whether in the form of silver coins or valuable cargo like textiles or spices, was physically present on that single vessel, making each voyage a significant undertaking. The journey overland had its own, similar set of challenges. Roads were often little more than dirt tracks, becoming slow and difficult to pass in poor weather. A merchant's wagon, heavy with goods or chests of coin, moved at the speed of a walking animal. Along the way, there were tolls to be paid at bridges, at city gates, and to local lords whose lands the caravan had to cross. The security of the cargo was a constant concern, requiring the hiring of guards or the decision to travel in larger, slower groups for safety. These physical risks were accompanied by the risk of time itself. Communication traveled no faster than the quickest horse or ship. A merchant might send a cargo of wool to a distant port, only to find upon its arrival months later that the price had fallen due to an oversupply. Information was always weeks or even months out of date. This meant every long-distance venture was based on a degree of calculated speculation. In essence, long-distance trade was a slow and methodical occupation, where the primary concerns were the physical safety of the goods and the capital used to trade them. The constant exposure to these quiet, persistent risks created a natural incentive for merchants to find a new way, a method to move value across great distances without having to physically move the wealth itself. In a world where long-distance trade was filled with uncertainty, the most valuable asset a merchant could possess was not their gold or their goods, but their reputation. Before the existence of formal banks or credit agencies, the entire system of lending and partnership was built upon a foundation of personal trust. This trust was cultivated slowly, through years of consistent and honest dealings, and it formed the invisible architecture of early commerce. The process of extending credit was a quiet and personal affair. Imagine a merchant who needed capital to purchase a shipment of spices from a distant land. They would not fill out an application, but would instead approach a wealthier, more established member of their community or merchant guild. The lender's decision would be based on a careful, informal assessment of the borrower's character. Was this person known for paying their debts on time? Did their family have a long history of reliable trade? What did other merchants in the marketplace say about their conduct? A merchant's good name was a public record, discussed and understood within their network. This reliance on reputation meant that merchant communities were often close-knit. Information traveled through word of mouth, and a single dishonest act could follow a person from one port to another, making it very difficult to secure future partners or financing. Conversely, a merchant who consistently honored their agreements, delivered goods as promised, and settled accounts fairly, would find more opportunities open to them. Their reputation acted as a form of collateral, assuring others that any money lent or goods advanced would be handled responsibly. Merchant guilds often played a role in this, setting standards of conduct and arbitrating disputes, further reinforcing the importance of maintaining a solid standing. In simple terms, early credit was a measure of an individual's reliability. It was an extension of trust from one person to another, based on a shared understanding of past behavior. A good reputation was carefully built and meticulously maintained, as it was the key to securing the capital needed to participate in the growing world of trade. This deeply personal system of trust, while effective, also laid the groundwork for more formal methods of recording and transferring these obligations across greater distances. In the ancient world, long before the idea of a formal bank, the need for a safe place to store valuables was a fundamental concern. For individuals and for the community as a whole, protecting surplus grain from spoilage and precious metals from theft was essential for stability. The most trusted and physically secure buildings in many early cities were the temples, which gradually took on the role of central depositories for the community's wealth. In civilizations like Mesopotamia and Egypt, temples were more than just places of worship. They were large, well-built complexes, often situated at the heart of a city. Their thick walls, guarded gates, and the constant presence of priests and temple staff made them the most secure locations available. This physical security was reinforced by a powerful social and spiritual trust. A temple was considered sacred ground, under the protection of the gods, making theft from it a serious offense not just against the community, but against the divine. Farmers and merchants would bring their surplus grain, silver, and other valuables to the temple for safekeeping. The process of making a deposit was an orderly one. Temple scribes, who were among the few literate members of society, would meticulously record each transaction. Using a stylus on a wet clay tablet, they would note the name of the depositor, the type of good, and the exact quantity. The tablet would then be dried or baked, creating a permanent, tamper-proof receipt. The goods themselves would be stored in secure storerooms or vaults deep within the temple complex. This system of careful record-keeping and secure storage meant that the temple functioned as a reliable guardian of wealth. It was not a bank in the modern sense. It did not typically lend this money out, but it fulfilled the essential first function of banking, the safe and trusted storage of assets. So these ancient temples served as the earliest vaults. They combined physical strength with the community's deep-seated respect for the sacred, creating a space where wealth could be protected. This foundational role of providing secure storage was a quiet but crucial step. It established the very idea that a central, trusted institution could be responsible for looking after the assets of others, a concept that would slowly evolve over many centuries. The choice of temples and other religious institutions as the first safekeepers of wealth was about more than just their sturdy walls. It was a decision rooted in a profound and widely held sacred trust. The act of placing one's gold, silver, or important documents within these spaces was a gesture of faith, not only in the physical security of the location, but in the moral integrity of the institution itself. This trust was built upon several quiet, steady pillars. First was the powerful belief that such places were under divine protection. A violation of a temple or a monastery was not seen as a simple theft. It was considered a sacrilegious act, an offense against the gods or a higher power. This shared belief created a powerful deterrent, a layer of security that went far beyond what locks or human guards alone could provide. The wealth was protected by both stone and spirit. Furthermore, these institutions offered a sense of permanence that was rare in the ancient and medieval world. Individual merchants could face misfortune, and ruling families could change. But a city's main temple or a well-established monastery was an enduring landmark. It was expected to outlast the lifespan of any single person, making it a reliable custodian for long-term deposits and even the execution of wills. In times of war or civil unrest, these sacred precincts were often respected as neutral ground, a sanctuary where assets could be shielded from the conflicts of the secular world. Inside, the work of managing these deposits was typically handled by priests or monks, who were among the most educated members of society. Their literacy was a vital tool for the meticulous record-keeping that this responsibility required. Each deposit was carefully noted, providing a clear and honest account for the owner. This combination of spiritual authority, physical security, and reliable administration made religious institutions the natural and most trusted option for the safekeeping of money. This foundational idea of a neutral and respected guardian protecting the assets of others was a quiet but essential step in the long journey toward banking. As commerce expanded throughout the Roman world, the informal systems of personal trust and reputation began to be supplemented by a more formal and durable method, the written record. Roman society was built upon a deep respect for law and precise documentation, and this approach was applied just as carefully to financial matters as it was to civic administration. This created a new layer of certainty for loans, payments, and other transactions. When one person lent money to another, the agreement was not simply left to memory or a verbal promise. It was meticulously documented in a written contract. This process was a quiet and orderly affair. The two parties, along with several witnesses, would meet to finalize the terms. A scribe would then record all the essential details onto a surface like a wax tablet or a sheet of papyrus. The names of the lender and borrower were written down, along with the exact sum of the loan, the agreed-upon date for repayment, and any interest to be paid. The witnesses would then affix their seals to the document, transforming it into a legally binding instrument. This physical contract served as undeniable proof of the debt. Professional money changers known as argentarii stu took this practice a step further. Stationed in the bustling forums of Roman cities, they kept detailed account books or ledgers. These books systematically tracked every deposit, withdrawal, and loan they managed. This careful record-keeping was not just for their own reference. In the event of a dispute, these ledgers could be presented in a court of law as evidence. A person could even make a payment to another by instructing their argentarius to transfer the funds from their account to another, a transaction that would be carefully noted in the banker's books. In essence, the Romans established the principle that a financial obligation was something that could be captured in writing. This transition from a purely personal promise to a formal, documented contract was a significant development. It made agreements more secure, more transparent, and enforceable through a legal process. This quiet habit of writing things down provided a stable and reliable framework for economic life, forming yet another essential building block for the systems of finance to come. The unified and documented systems of the Roman world provided a stable foundation for commerce over a vast area. However, over several centuries, this large-scale network underwent a slow and quiet transformation. As the central administrative structures of the Roman era gradually faded, the economic landscape of Europe became more fragmented, and the nature of trade began to change with it. This was not a sudden event, but a gradual shift. The extensive network of Roman roads, which had allowed goods and information to travel with relative ease, slowly fell into disrepair. Without a central authority to maintain them, long-distance travel became more difficult and less predictable. The journey from one region to another grew longer and required navigating a patchwork of local territories. The single, unified legal system that had once guaranteed contracts across provinces was replaced by a variety of local laws and customs. A written agreement, made in one town, might not be interpreted the same way in the next. Similarly, the consistent and widely accepted Roman currency began to disappear from circulation. In its place, local lords and kingdoms started minting their own coins. This meant a merchant traveling from one place to another had to constantly deal with different types of money, each with its own weight and purity. The straightforward process of payment became a more complicated act of exchange and assessment, reminiscent of earlier times. As a result of these gradual changes, long-distance trade became a less common activity. Commerce did not stop, but it did return to a more local scale. Most economic life centered around a single town and its immediate surroundings. The large, interconnected marketplace of the Roman world slowly broke apart into many smaller, more self-sufficient economic islands. This period of fragmentation meant that the old, centralized ways of securing and transferring wealth were no longer practical, creating a quiet need for new solutions to emerge when long-distance trade eventually began to grow once more. In the growing cities of 17th-century England, a new set of practical needs emerged for merchants and wealthy citizens. As they accumulated capital in the form of gold and silver coins, the simple question of where to keep it safe became a pressing concern. Storing large sums of money at home was not always secure. This quiet need for safekeeping found an answer in an unlikely place: the workshop of the local goldsmith. Goldsmiths were craftsmen who worked with precious metals every day. Their business naturally required a high level of security to protect their own valuable inventory. They had strong rooms, sturdy vaults, and secure chests built directly into their premises. For a merchant looking for a safe place to store their personal wealth, the goldsmith shop was one of the most fortified and trusted locations in the city. A new practice slowly began to take hold. A person would bring their excess gold and silver coins to a goldsmith, not to be melted down or made into jewelry, but simply for storage. The goldsmith would carefully count the coins in the depositor's presence and then issue a formal written receipt. This document was a simple handwritten note stating the exact amount received and promising to return the coins to the bearer of the note on demand. For a small fee, the goldsmith provided peace of mind, acting as a secure custodian for the wealth of their clients. This was not yet banking as we know it, but a straightforward service of safekeeping. The goldsmith's strongbox, once used only for their own materials, now held the deposits of many different people. Their reputation for honesty and the physical security of their workshops made them the natural choice for this important role. In essence, the goldsmiths became trusted guardians of other people's money. The paper receipts they issued were simple promises, physical tokens representing the gold that sat securely in their vaults. This quiet, practical arrangement, born from a simple need for security, was about to lay the foundation for a fundamental shift in the nature of money itself. The paper receipt issued by a goldsmith was, at first, a very simple and straightforward document. It was a tangible promise, a piece of paper that represented a specific amount of physical gold held in a secure vault. Its only intended purpose was to serve as a claim check, allowing the owner to retrieve their coins whenever they wished. Over time, however, a quiet and practical evolution began to take place, as merchants realized the paper itself could be used in a new way. The process of this change was driven by convenience. Imagine a merchant who needed to pay a debt of 100 gold coins. The standard procedure would be to walk to the goldsmith's shop, present the receipt, wait for the heavy coins to be counted out, and then carry that sack of gold across the city to the creditor. The creditor, in turn, would now have the problem of securing these coins, and would likely take them right back to the same goldsmith for safekeeping, receiving a new paper receipt. Merchants, being practical people, soon recognized the inefficiency in this routine. If both parties trusted the goldsmith, the physical transfer of gold was an unnecessary step. Instead, the debtor could simply hand over the goldsmith's receipt for 100 coins to their creditor. The ownership of the gold changed hands, but the coins themselves never left the vault. The receipt was accepted as payment because everyone knew it was a reliable promise, fully backed by the metal stored in a trusted location. This was a profound, yet subtle shift. The paper notes began to circulate from one person to another, used to settle debts and purchase goods. They were lighter than coins, easier to carry, and more discreet. The value was no longer in the physical object being exchanged, but in the shared confidence that the paper could be converted back to gold at any time. The simple receipt, created for the sole purpose of safekeeping, had quietly become a new form of money. It was a tangible representation of trust, a precursor to the paper currency that would one day become commonplace. Through the quiet rhythm of their daily work, the goldsmiths of London became deeply familiar with the habits of money. Their shops were places of steady, methodical activity. They would watch as customers came and went, some leaving sacks of heavy coins for safekeeping, others presenting a signed paper receipt to make a withdrawal. Each transaction was carefully noted in a thick, leather-bound ledger, and as the pages of these ledgers filled, a clear and simple pattern emerged. The goldsmiths observed that on any given day, the requests for withdrawals of physical gold were only a small fraction of the total amount they held in their secure vaults. While the paper receipts circulated freely throughout the city, settling debts and paying for goods, the actual gold they represented remained, for the most part, dormant. The vast majority of their clients were content to let their wealth sit, knowing it was safe, and that the paper they held was as good as the gold itself. This quiet observation led to a practical and transformative idea. The gold sitting idle in the strong boxes was a sleeping asset. It was secure, but it was not contributing to the bustling commerce just outside the workshop doors. At the same time, the goldsmith knew many trustworthy merchants who needed short-term loans to finance their own enterprises. It seemed a logical step to put this idle resource to use. The goldsmith could lend out a portion of the deposited gold, confident that they would always have enough on hand to meet the daily withdrawal requests. The process was handled with the same care as their other dealings. A borrower would sign a formal agreement, promising to repay the loan by a certain date, along with an additional amount as a fee for the service. This fee was called interest, and it provided a new source of revenue for the goldsmith. In this way, their business model began to shift. The goldsmith was no longer just a guardian of wealth. They had become a financial intermediary, taking the savings of some and lending it to others, all based on the simple understanding that not everyone would ask for their gold back at the same time. This new practice of lending out deposited gold required a careful and methodical approach. The goldsmiths understood that their entire business now rested on a delicate balance. They could not simply lend out all the gold they held, as they still had a duty to return a depositor's coins upon request. Their solution was a system born from practical experience and the careful study of their own account books. This system, which would later be known as fractional reserve banking, was based on a simple observation of patterns. The goldsmith would review his ledgers and see that, week after week, the flow of withdrawals was remarkably consistent. On an average day, perhaps only 1/10 of the gold in his vault was ever claimed. To be safe, he might decide to always keep 1/5 or 20% of the total deposits on hand in physical coin. This portion of the gold was his reserve. The remaining 4/5 could be safely lent out to borrowers, generating interest and profit. This was a fundamental shift in how money worked. For the first time, the total value of the paper receipts circulating in the economy was greater than the actual amount of physical gold stored in the vaults. A goldsmith might hold 10,000 gold coins, but have issued receipts and loans equivalent to 12,000 or more. The system functioned smoothly because of collective trust. As long as people had faith in the goldsmith's paper notes, and as long as not everyone demanded their physical gold at the exact same moment, the financial ecosystem remained stable and sound. In simple terms, fractional reserve banking was the practice of keeping only a fraction of depositors, gold on hand, and lending out the rest. It was a quiet innovation that allowed the goldsmiths to transform idle savings into active capital. The secure back rooms of their shops, once simple storage spaces, had become the engines of a new kind of economic activity. This carefully managed system of reserves and loans marked the true beginning of banking as a dynamic force in commerce. At the very heart of the evolving world of banking lies a single, quiet transaction: the deposit. This simple act, repeated countless times, forms the foundational relationship between an individual and their bank. It is the cornerstone upon which all other financial services are built, a moment of trust made tangible through a calm and orderly process. The procedure itself is one of methodical simplicity. A customer, whether a merchant with the day's earnings or a worker with their wages, would approach the banker. They would place their money, be it gold and silver coins or, later, paper notes, onto the counter. The banker or a clerk would then carefully count the sum, often in plain view of the depositor, ensuring accuracy and transparency. Once the amount was verified, the crucial step would take place: the recording of the transaction. In a large, heavy ledger, the clerk would dip a pen in ink and make an entry. The date, the customer's name, and the amount of the deposit were carefully written down. This act transformed the physical cash into a formal record, a credit to the customer's account. In this moment, a subtle but important change occurred. The specific coins handed over no longer belonged to the depositor. They became part of the bank's general funds. In their place, the depositor now held a claim, a legal right to that value. The entry in the ledger, and often a smaller passbook given to the customer, was the proof of this claim. The bank now owed them that money, and the depositor trusted the bank to return it whenever it was requested. So the act of making a deposit is more than just paying for safekeeping. It is the creation of an account, a formal acknowledgement of a debt owed by the bank to the customer. This quiet, routine interaction, based on careful counting and meticulous record-keeping, is the essential starting point. It is the steady inflow of individual savings that provides the bank with the resources it needs to operate, making it the most fundamental element of the entire banking system. Each individual deposit, recorded so carefully in the banker's ledger, was a small and quiet event. On its own, the savings of a single craftsperson or shopkeeper represented a modest sum, enough for their personal security but not enough to fund a significant enterprise. When viewed together, however, these numerous small accounts created something entirely new. They formed a large, central pool of capital, a reservoir of funds held in trust by the bank. The banker, looking over the totals in their ledger at the end of each day, did not see 100 separate small piles of money. They saw one large, consolidated fund. This collective pool had a stability that no single account possessed. On any given day, some customers would make withdrawals while others made deposits. These small movements in opposite directions tended to balance each other out, keeping the total amount of capital held by the bank remarkably steady. This predictable stability was the key. A merchant needing to purchase a full cargo of wool or finance the construction of a new workshop required a substantial amount of money, far more than any single saver could provide. But they did not need to find 50 different people willing to lend them a small amount. They could simply go to the bank. The bank, using the large, stable pool of capital created by all its depositors, could confidently provide the merchant with the sizable loan they needed. It was acting as an intermediary, a quiet bridge between two different groups of people. On one side were the depositors, who wanted a safe place for their savings but had no immediate use for the money themselves. On the other side were the merchants and entrepreneurs, who had productive ideas and a need for capital to put them into action. In simple terms, the bank gathered the idle savings of many and made them available to the few who could use them to create new business. It transformed scattered, inactive money into a concentrated and productive resource. This process of accumulation and lending, all managed through the careful and methodical entries in an account book, allowed the wealth of a community to be put to work in a way that had never before been possible. As the practice of banking grew, so did the sheer volume of information that needed to be managed. The simple trust between individuals was no longer enough. A more systematic way of tracking the steady flow of money was required. This need drove the quiet evolution of financial record-keeping, from simple memory aids to the organized and indispensable ledger book. In the earliest days of commerce, records were often straightforward and chronological. A merchant might keep a simple daybook, a single running list of everything that happened. An entry might read, received 10 silver coins from a spice trader, followed the next day by, paid 3 silver coins for a bolt of cloth. This method was a useful diary of transactions, but it had its limitations. To find out how much a particular customer owed, or to understand the overall financial health of the business, one would have to read through the entire book, carefully picking out and adding up every relevant entry. This was a slow and painstaking process. The solution was a move toward organization. Instead of one long list, the financial ledger was developed. This was typically a large, heavy book, bound in sturdy leather. Inside, its pages were carefully ruled with lines and columns. The key innovation was dedicating a separate page, or a section of a page, to each individual customer or account. Now, all transactions related to the spice trader would be recorded in one specific place. The process became more methodical. When the trader made a deposit, the clerk would turn through the heavy pages to find the correct account, dip his quill in a pot of ink, and make a neat entry in the credit column. A withdrawal would be noted in the debit column on the same page. This simple act of organization brought a new level of clarity. At a single glance, a banker could now see the complete history of an account and its current balance. The ledger was no longer just a diary of events. It was a structured map of financial relationships. This evolution from a simple tally to an organized book of accounts was a quiet but essential step. It provided the clear, reliable, and easily accessible information that was necessary to manage the growing complexities of deposits, loans, and commerce. The financial ledger became more than just a tool for organization. It was the central, authoritative record of wealth. Its sturdy pages and neat columns of ink provided a new kind of certainty in the world of commerce. The ledger was the definitive proof of ownership, a silent witness to every transaction that passed through the bank. The process for making a payment was now a quiet, paper-based routine. A merchant would send a written instruction to their banker. The banker, in turn, would open the heavy ledger to the merchant's page. A debit or a subtraction would be carefully recorded, noting the date and the recipient. Then, the banker would turn to the recipient's page and make a corresponding credit entry, an addition of the same amount. The transfer of funds was complete, achieved entirely through the precise movement of a pen across paper. The physical money never had to be moved or counted. The book itself was the arena where the exchange took place. In this way, the ledger acted as a silent, impartial witness. Should a disagreement arise between two merchants about a payment, the book held the definitive answer. Its neat columns and dated entries provided a clear and indisputable history, a single source of truth that both parties had agreed to trust. The banker's role evolved into that of a trusted record keeper, the custodian of the community's financial memory. This meticulous tracking ensured that every coin was accounted for, its journey from one owner to another carefully documented. In short, the clear and organized ledger provided two essential functions. First, it served as concrete proof of how much value a person held with the bank, replacing a physical hoard of coins with a formal, recorded claim. Second, it created a complete and reliable history of every transaction, bringing transparency and order to the flow of commerce. This quiet system of written proof was fundamental, building the trust necessary for a more complex and interconnected economy to function smoothly. As trade began to reawaken across Europe, certain cities, by virtue of their unique geography, found themselves at the very heart of this new activity. Among the most important of these were the bustling port cities of Italy, such as Venice and Genoa. They became the primary gateways through which the wealth and goods of the East flowed into the developing markets of the West. Their position on the Mediterranean Sea made them a natural bridge between worlds. Ships would depart from their harbors, undertaking the long and carefully planned voyages to the ports of the Levant and the Byzantine Empire. There, they would trade for goods that were in high demand in Europe, spices like pepper and cinnamon, fine silks, and rare dyes. These same ships would then return, their holds filled with valuable cargo, ready to be sold to merchants who would carry them further inland, across the Alps and into France, Germany, and beyond. This was not a passive role. These cities actively cultivated their position. They built and maintained large fleets of merchant vessels, becoming masters of the sea routes. Their sailors and navigators were among the most skilled of their time. The life of these cities revolved around this commerce. Their harbors were forests of masts, and their waterfronts were lined with large, sturdy warehouses for storing goods between voyages. A complex ecosystem of shipbuilders, sailmakers, and provisioners supported this constant hum of maritime activity. In essence, Venice and Genoa became the great interchangers of medieval trade. They were the points where different cultures, currencies, and goods converged. A merchant in these cities would deal with a vast array of coins, languages, and business customs on a daily basis. This constant flow of different currencies, valuable cargoes, and complex transactions created a unique set of challenges. It was precisely this environment of high-volume, long-distance trade that created the fertile ground for new and more sophisticated financial tools to develop. The immense wealth that flowed through the ledgers of Italian banking houses did not remain as simple entries on a page. It was a tangible force that quietly reshaped the very fabric of the cities themselves, influencing everything from the art in a public square to the workings of the city government. This transformation was a slow and deliberate process, driven by the powerful merchant and banking families who managed this new economy. These families, having accumulated vast fortunes through trade and finance, began to use their capital in new ways. They became patrons, providing the funding for the art and architecture that would come to define the Renaissance. The process was much like a business transaction. A wealthy banker might decide to fund the construction of a new chapel or a public building. A contract would be drawn up with an architect, specifying the design, the quality of the stone to be used, and a schedule for the work. Similarly, they would commission painters and sculptors, providing them with the financial stability and the costly materials, like gold leaf and rare pigments, needed to create their masterpieces. This patronage was a way to display wealth and civic pride, transforming private fortunes into public beauty. This financial influence also extended directly into the world of politics. The same banking houses that managed the accounts of local wool merchants also handled the finances of popes, princes, and kings. They provided the large loans needed to fund governments, pay for armies, or undertake ambitious projects. Over time, this role as the chief lender to the state gave these families significant political leverage. They became advisors and, in some cases, the rulers themselves, their experience in managing complex financial networks making them adept at managing the affairs of the city. In this way, the skills of banking and commerce were woven directly into the cultural and political life of the era. The careful management of money honed in the counting houses and international trade routes became the engine that funded the artistic achievements and political structures of the Renaissance. The wealth was not just stored, it was put to work, leaving a legacy written not just in account books, but in stone, marble, and paint. As the volume of trade grew, the simple ledger, with its single columns for each account, needed to evolve. A new method of record-keeping emerged, one that brought a profound sense of order and clarity to the complexities of commerce. This system, known as double-entry bookkeeping, was built upon a quiet and elegant symmetry. It viewed every transaction not as a single event, but as a balanced exchange with two equal parts. The fundamental principle was that for every financial action, there were always two effects to be recorded. These were called the debit and the credit. In this system, these were not words of debt or praise, but simply neutral labels for the two sides of an exchange. The debit recorded where the value went, Metzen to, and the credit recorded where the value came from. For the books to be considered correct, the amount of the debit and the amount of the credit for every single transaction had to be identical. Let us imagine a merchant who uses 10 gold florins from their cash box to buy a bolt of silk. The bookkeeper, with a steady hand, would make two separate but related entries in the ledger. First, in the cash account, a credit of 10 florins would be recorded, showing that the value had left the cash box. At the same time, in the silk inventory account, a debit of 10 florins would be entered, showing that the same value had arrived in the form of new goods. The books remained in perfect balance. The merchant's overall wealth was unchanged, but its form had been transformed from coin to cloth. This simple but powerful method created a complete, self-checking system. It ensured that no value could enter or leave the business without being fully accounted for. Every credit had its corresponding debit, creating a seamless and logical story of every transaction. This quiet symmetry brought an unprecedented level of accuracy and confidence to financial management, allowing a merchant to see the true state of their affairs with just a glance at the balanced pages of their book. The widespread adoption of this balanced accounting system was a quiet but profound transformation. It moved beyond being a simple tool for preventing errors and became a new way for merchants and bankers to see and understand the flow of money. The clear, symmetrical structure of the ledger provided a detailed and reliable map of their entire financial world. With this new method, a merchant could gain an unprecedented level of insight into their business. Before, it was difficult to know if a single trading voyage had been truly profitable. Now a bookkeeper could create a separate account for that specific venture. Every cost associated with the journey, the purchase of cargo, the wages for the crew, the fees paid in a foreign port, would be carefully recorded as a debit to that account. When the goods were sold, the revenue would be entered as a credit. At the end of the voyage, the final balance of that single account would show, with perfect clarity, the exact profit or loss. This allowed a merchant to make better decisions, comparing the performance of different trade routes or different types of goods. Furthermore, this system provided a complete and holistic view of the business at any given moment. By adding up all the debit balances and all the credit balances across every single account, a merchant could create a summary of their entire financial position. This would show them everything they owned, their assets, and everything they owed, their liabilities. The fact that these two totals always had to balance provided a constant, reassuring check on the accuracy of the records. In essence, this clear accounting system replaced estimation and intuition with precise, verifiable data. It transformed the management of trade by making it possible to measure performance, identify opportunities, and understand risk with a new degree of confidence. For bankers, it provided a trustworthy way to assess the financial health of a merchant seeking a loan, making the entire system of credit more stable and secure. The complexities of commerce were now contained and understood within the calm, ordered lines of the balanced book. The integrity of the great banking houses rested not just on the vision of the bankers, but on the quiet, meticulous work of their clerks. The daily life of these individuals was a steady rhythm of procedure and precision, centered on the most important object in the room, the financial ledger. Their work was the unseen foundation that allowed the entire system to function with confidence and order. The clerk's day would unfold at a heavy wooden desk, their tools laid out in a familiar, orderly fashion. There was the ledger itself, a massive book bound in dark leather, its pages filled with neat, ruled lines. Beside it sat a well of black ink, a sharpened quill pen, and a small shaker filled with fine sand for blotting. Throughout the day, notes detailing recent transactions would be brought to them. For each one, the process was the same. The clerk would read the slip of paper carefully, understanding the nature of the exchange. They would then open the ledger and, with a slow, deliberate hand, find the first of the two required accounts. They would dip the quill, record the date, a brief description, and the amount in the debit column. A careful sprinkle of sand would absorb any excess ink. Then, they would turn the heavy pages to the second account and repeat the process, making an identical entry in the credit column. This work was methodical and repetitive, a craft of patience rather than inspiration. The clerk's primary responsibility was to maintain the perfect balance of the book. At the close of business, they would undertake the final, crucial task of the day, adding up all the debits and all the credits from every transaction. The goal was for these two grand totals to match exactly, down to the last coin. The quiet satisfaction of this final, successful balance was the mark of a day's work well done. It meant that the financial world of the banking house was in complete and verifiable order. Every transaction was accounted for, every sum was in its proper place. With the heavy ledger closed for the night, a sense of calm and certainty would settle over the counting house. The balanced ledger, with its neat columns of debits and credits, was the physical embodiment of order. Yet, the trust that merchants and citizens placed in these early banks was built on something more than just skillful bookkeeping. It was founded on the twin pillars of unwavering accuracy and demonstrable honesty. These were not abstract virtues, but practical qualities that were proven day after day, in every single transaction. Accuracy was the first and most visible test of a bank's reliability. For a merchant entrusting their entire fortune to a banking house, even a small error in the ledger could sow doubt. The trust was maintained through the consistent, flawless execution of the clerk's duties. The community understood that the bank's records were not just estimates, but a precise and verifiable reflection of reality. This meticulous attention to detail transformed the ledger from a simple account book into a trusted, impartial record of the community's financial life. It was a promise of competence, written in ink. Beyond the accuracy of the numbers, however, was the essential element of the banker's personal integrity. In a world where business was still deeply personal, a banker's reputation was their single most valuable asset. They were more than just managers of money. They were custodians of their clients' livelihoods. This required a deep and abiding honesty. It meant charging fair fees, providing sound advice, and maintaining the discretion expected of someone with access to such sensitive financial information. A banker who was known to be scrupulous and fair in all their dealings would attract the deposits and the loyalty of the entire merchant community. In essence, the system of banking could only function if the people within it were trusted. The flawless accuracy of the ledger was the proof of the bank's operational honesty, while the personal character of the banker was the guarantee that stood behind it. It was this powerful combination of a reliable system and trustworthy individuals that allowed these institutions to become central pillars of the economy. They were seen not just as places to store money, but as centers of stability, order, and integrity in an often uncertain world. The origins of banking as a public service can be traced back to a very simple piece of furniture: a sturdy wooden bench. In the bustling marketplaces and public squares of medieval Italian cities, a specialized kind of merchant would set up their place of business for the day. These were the money changers, and their bench, or banca in Italian, was their office, their counter, and the symbol of their trade. Their work was a direct response to the fragmented nature of medieval currency. A merchant arriving in Venice from a trade fair in France would be carrying a pouch of French coins. Before they could buy local goods or pay for lodging, they needed to exchange this foreign money for the Venetian ducat. This was the primary service of the money changer. The process was a public and transparent one. The money changer would sit at their bench, upon which rested a small, sensitive balance scale and a collection of standardized weights. They would take a foreign coin, carefully weigh it, and inspect its purity, perhaps referencing a small book that detailed the various currencies of Europe. Based on this assessment, they would offer an exchange rate, providing a certain number of local coins for the foreign ones. For this service, they charged a small, predictable fee. This was a vital function in the great trading hubs, allowing commerce between different regions to proceed smoothly. The money changer's bench, situated in the open air of the marketplace, was a place of constant, quiet activity. It was a visible and trusted fixture of economic life, the first point of contact for any traveler or merchant needing to engage with the local economy. In this simple wooden bench, we see the very roots of the word, bank. The banca was the physical place where financial transactions were conducted, out in the open, built upon the money changer's personal reputation for honesty and expertise. It was from this humble public workstation that the more complex and private world of the banking house would eventually grow. The money changer's bench was more than just a convenient workstation. It was a clear statement about the nature of this early form of banking. Unlike the private, imposing stone buildings we might think of today, these first financial services were conducted in the open, in the full view of the public. This physical presence was not a minor detail. It was the very mechanism through which trust was built and maintained. The process of building this trust was a slow daily routine. The money changer was a familiar figure in the marketplace, someone you would see in the same spot, day after day. This consistency created a sense of stability and reliability. A merchant did not have to seek out a hidden office or deal with an unknown clerk. They could approach a person whose face and reputation were known throughout the community. Every transaction, every weighing of a coin, was an open and observable act. This transparency was a powerful guarantee of fairness, as any hint of dishonesty would be quickly noticed and discussed among the other merchants. This public setting meant that the banker's reputation and their physical self were inseparable. Their good name was their most crucial business asset, and it was on display for all to see. To maintain it, they had to be consistently honest, knowledgeable, and fair in their dealings. If a banker failed in their obligations or their bench was suddenly empty one morning, the loss was immediate and total. There was no corporate entity to hide behind. There was only the individual, and their presence was their promise. In this way, the foundations of banking were deeply personal. Trust was not placed in an abstract institution, but in a specific, visible person who was a regular part of the community's daily life. This reliance on the physical presence of the banker, and the public accountability that came with it, was the necessary groundwork. It created the essential confidence that would allow these simple services to one day move from the open marketplace into the more formal setting of the banking house. In the city of Florence, the practice of banking reached a new level of scale and sophistication with the rise of great banking houses, most notably that of the Medici family. Their innovation was not just in the volume of their business, but in the careful and deliberate structure they created to manage it. They built an international network that was both centrally controlled and remarkably flexible. The heart of the operation was the main bank in Florence. This was the central hub, the quiet administrative core from which the entire network was managed. From this center, a series of branches were established in the key commercial cities of Europe, such as London, Bruges, and Rome. Each of these branches, however, was not simply a remote office. It was established as a legally separate partnership. This was a methodical and clever arrangement. The Medici family in Florence would be the senior partner, providing the majority of the capital and the authority of their name. The local branch manager, often a trusted employee who had proven his skill over many years, would be made a junior partner. This partnership structure served two important purposes. First, by giving the local manager a personal stake in the profits of his own branch, it created a powerful incentive for careful and responsible management. The success of the branch was directly tied to his own fortune. Second, this legal separation of the branches provided a crucial layer of stability for the entire network. If the London branch were to suffer a major loss on a wool trade, for example, its financial difficulties would be contained. The partnership in London might fail, but it would not legally endanger the healthy and profitable branches in other cities. In this way, the Medici created a system that could operate across vast distances with a balance of central oversight and local autonomy. It was a network of connected but independent parts, all linked back to the central ledger in Florence. This quiet organizational structure was a key to their success, allowing them to manage the immense complexities of international finance with a new degree of prudence and control. The vast wealth managed by the Medici Bank was not merely an abstract figure in a Florentine ledger. It was an active force, a pool of capital that was methodically channeled into projects that would define the physical and political landscape of their city. The same skills of careful management and prudent investment that made the bank a commercial success were applied to the realms of art, architecture, and governance. When the Medici family undertook the role of patron, they approached it with the same meticulous organization they applied to a new business venture. Funding a major work of art, like a bronze statue or a series of frescoes, was treated as a complex project to be managed. The bank's clerks would open a new account for the commission. Every expense, from the wages paid to the artist's assistants to the cost of the marble quarried in Carrara, or the rare blue pigment ground from lapis lazuli, was carefully recorded. This process ensured the project was managed efficiently, but it also transformed the bank into the administrative heart of the Florentine Renaissance. The counting house became a quiet hub for the city's creative life. This financial influence extended naturally into the sphere of politics. The Medici were the primary bankers to the papacy in Rome, a prestigious and highly profitable relationship that gave them immense influence. By providing the essential service of managing the vast revenues of the Church across Europe, they became indispensable allies to some of the most powerful figures of the age. Within Florence itself, their wealth allowed them to build a deep network of loyalty. They provided loans to other merchant families, funded public works, and quietly ensured that key positions in the city's government were held by their supporters. In this way, the Medici Bank became the city's unofficial center of power. Their influence was not based on noble titles or military force, but on the quiet, steady authority that came from being the custodians and allocators of capital. Through the careful and strategic use of their financial resources, they transformed their commercial enterprise into a political dynasty, guiding the fortunes of Florence from the rooms of their own banking house. The great banking houses of Florence were not simply local institutions. They were vast international enterprises, the quiet financial centers of their age. From a central office in Florence, their influence extended across the continent, managed through a carefully constructed network of branches and trusted agents. The scale of their operations was unprecedented, connecting the economic life of Europe through the methodical entries in their ledgers. Their reach was built upon the major trade arteries of the time. A Florentine bank would have a significant presence in the wool markets of England, the bustling trade fairs of Flanders, and the powerful political centers of Rome and Avignon. This network was not just for show. It was a functioning system for moving capital. A merchant in Bruges who needed to finance a large purchase of English wool could secure a loan from the local Florentine branch. That loan was backed by the capital and the good name of the entire banking house, with its deep reserves held hundreds of miles away in Italy. The bank acted as a silent partner in these great commercial ventures. The clients of these houses were a reflection of their immense scale. They managed the accounts of local textile guilds and individual merchants, but they also served as the primary financiers for the most powerful institutions in Europe. They collected papal taxes from across Christendom, a complex logistical task that involved gathering various local currencies and consolidating them. They provided the enormous loans that kings and princes required to fund their courts, their building projects, and their armies. This international system was held together by a slow but steady flow of information. Couriers on horseback and captains of ships carried sealed letters between the branches, containing detailed reports, market updates, and instructions. The main ledger in Florence was the ultimate repository of all this knowledge, a comprehensive map of the bank's assets and liabilities across a dozen different lands and currencies. Through this quiet, systematic coordination, the Florentine banking houses became the indispensable financial backbone of European commerce and politics. While lending to merchants was a business built on predictable rules and legal contracts, extending credit to monarchs and princes was a different matter entirely. It was a prestigious and often profitable venture, but it carried a quiet, fundamental risk that set it apart from all other forms of finance. The process of lending to a sovereign was a high-level affair, negotiated between the banker and the royal court. The loans were immense, required to fund state activities or prolonged wars. The promise of repayment was secured not by collateral or a standard legal contract, but by the monarch's own word and the future tax revenues of their kingdom. This was the core of the risk. A merchant who defaulted on a loan could be taken to court, their assets seized and sold to cover the debt. A king, however, was the source of the law itself. There was no higher authority to which a banker could appeal if a sovereign chose not to honor their obligations. This was a known and accepted part of the arrangement. The bankers understood that a king's financial decisions were often driven by political necessity rather than commercial principles. A costly war that ended poorly or a shift in political alliances could make repayment impossible or simply inconvenient for the crown. In such cases, the monarch could unilaterally change the terms of the loan, or in some cases, simply repudiate the debt entirely. Over time, several of these large-scale defaults by powerful rulers began to place immense strain on the capital of the Florentine houses. A single unpaid royal loan could wipe out the profits from hundreds of smaller, successful commercial ventures. This was not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow and steady erosion of their foundations. The immense wealth that had been so carefully built through generations of meticulous trade and banking was gradually depleted by these unenforceable sovereign debts, leading to the quiet, eventual decline of these once great financial institutions. In the reawakening world of European trade, money was not a single, uniform substance. It was a complex and varied landscape of different currencies, each with its own history, weight, and value. The great trading cities and kingdoms all minted their own coins. A merchant from Florence would conduct their local business using the gold florin, while their counterpart in Venice would use the equally respected gold ducat. A journey to a trade fair in France or a port in England would introduce a new set of silver and gold coins to be navigated. This patchwork of currencies was a simple reality of long-distance commerce. It meant that for any merchant, the first and last step of a transaction in a foreign city was almost always the same: a visit to the money changer. This was a necessary and routine part of the work. The merchant would present their pouch of coins, and the money changer would begin a quiet, methodical process of assessment. Each coin had to be individually examined. Its weight was checked on a small, precise scale, and its purity or the fineness of its metal was judged based on experience and established standards. Based on this careful evaluation, the money changer would determine the coin's value in the local currency and offer an exchange rate. This process was repeated for every transaction, creating a constant need for the physical conversion of one type of metal into another. The banker or money changer, with their specialized knowledge of these various currencies, provided an indispensable service. Their bench was the quiet gateway through which international trade could flow. And so, the world of commerce was a world of constant calculation and conversion. The value of a shipment of English wool, priced in pounds sterling, had to be translated into the florins needed to pay the Florentine bankers who financed the voyage. This repetitive, hands-on process of exchanging one set of coins for another was a fundamental and ever-present feature of medieval trade. It was a practical problem that quietly called for a more elegant and less physical solution. The work of the money changer was a craft that required more than just a good scale. Their true value lay in their expertise, their practiced ability to look beyond a coin's official stamp and determine its real intrinsic worth. This assessment was a quiet and methodical ritual, a process of careful observation that was essential for fair and honest trade. The first step was a simple physical inspection. An experienced money changer would feel the weight of the coin in their palm, noting its thickness and the sharpness of its edges. Over time, coins could become worn, losing a small amount of their metal through simple handling. A more pressing concern was the practice of coin clipping, where small shavings were deliberately trimmed from the edges. The money changer's trained eye would look for any signs of this. After this initial glance, the coin would be placed on a delicate balance scale, its weight carefully measured against a set of known, standardized counterweights. The second and more crucial test was for purity. Not all gold coins were created equal. Some contained a higher proportion of gold to other, less valuable metals. To determine this, the money changer used a special tool called a touchstone. This was a small, flat slab of dark, abrasive stone, like slate. The money changer would rub the edge of the coin firmly across the stone, leaving a faint metallic streak on its dark surface. Beside this streak, they would then rub one of a series of needles, each tipped with a metal of a known and labeled purity. By carefully comparing the color and luster of the two streaks side by side, the money changer could accurately judge the fineness of the gold in the coin. In essence, the money changer was a trusted arbiter of value. Their skill was in reading the true story of a piece of metal, a story told by its weight and the color of its streak upon a stone. This quiet expertise, performed in public view, was the foundation of their reputation. It provided a necessary layer of certainty, ensuring that every transaction was based on a fair and transparent assessment of a coin's tangible worth. While the great banking houses provided a new level of organization for finance, a fundamental, physical problem remained at the heart of long-distance trade. To complete a transaction, a merchant in one city still had to find a way to pay a supplier in another, often hundreds of miles away. The most direct method was also the most cumbersome: the physical shipment of gold and silver coins. This process was defined by its weight and its risk. The value of an entire shipment of silk or a hold full of grain had to be matched by an equivalent mass of precious metal. This meant that alongside their regular cargo, merchants had to transport sturdy wooden chests, often bound with iron, filled with thousands of heavy coins. These chests were a significant burden, taking up valuable space on a cart or in a ship's hold, and adding to the overall cost of the journey. The simple physical mass of money was a constant logistical challenge. Beyond the weight, there was the inherent risk of the journey itself. The roads that connected the great trading centers were long and often isolated. A caravan heavy with gold was a tempting target, requiring the additional expense of hiring armed guards. The sea routes were no safer. The unpredictable nature of weather meant that a ship could be lost in a storm, taking its entire cargo, including the payment chests, to the bottom of the sea. The threat of piracy on certain passages was another constant, quiet concern. A single unfortunate event could result in the total loss of a merchant's capital. In short, shipping physical gold and silver was a slow, inefficient, and hazardous business. The capital was tied up for the entire duration of the long journey, unable to be used for any other purpose. This combination of physical burden and constant risk created a deep and practical need within the merchant community. They required a new instrument, a way to settle their accounts across great distances without the heavy, vulnerable chest of coins ever having to leave the safety of the bank's vault. The persistent challenges of shipping physical currency were not simply accepted as a permanent cost of doing business. For the community of merchants and bankers, these were practical problems that demanded a practical solution. The inefficiency of tying up capital for months, the constant low-level anxiety about the safety of the journey, and the sheer physical effort of it all created a steady, quiet pressure for change. This pressure became the gentle but powerful engine of a critical financial innovation. The search for a solution was a logical extension of the systems already in place. The great banking houses had already built the necessary foundations. They had established networks of trusted branches in different cities. They had developed meticulous and reliable systems of record-keeping. And, most importantly, they had cultivated reputations for honesty that were their most valuable asset. The question they began to ask was a simple one. Could this network of trust and information be used to replace the physical movement of gold? The emerging idea was that a promise, when written down and backed by a reputable bank, could travel more safely and efficiently than a chest of coins. If a banker in Florence could provide a merchant with a formal document, a letter of credit, that could be presented to their trusted partner in London, then a payment could be made without any gold ever crossing the Alps. The transaction would happen not on the road, but within the ledgers of the two banking houses. It was a solution based on paper and trust, rather than metal and muscle. In short, the very real and physical risks of long-distance trade were the direct motivation for creating a more abstract and secure method of payment. The need for a safer, more efficient way to settle accounts spurred the development of a new financial tool. It was a quiet revolution, born not in a moment of dramatic discovery, but in the slow, methodical search for a better way to conduct the ordinary business of the day. The solution to the problem of moving physical gold was not a new kind of ship or a safer road, but something much quieter and lighter. A formal, written promise. This simple piece of paper, which came to be known as a bill of exchange, was the foundational instrument of a new, more abstract form of commerce. It was the physical object that made long-distance credit possible. The structure of this document was defined by a calm and methodical logic. It was, in essence, a formal letter of instruction. Let us imagine a merchant in Bruges who has purchased a shipment of silk from a trader in Venice. Instead of sending a chest of coins, the Bruges merchant would sit at their desk, take out a sheet of paper, and with a careful hand, draft the bill. The document would contain a few essential pieces of information, always presented in a clear and predictable order. First, it would be dated. Next, it would state a specific sum of money in a specific currency, for example, 1,000 Venetian ducats. It would name the person to be paid, the silk trader in Venice. Crucially, it would also name the person or banking house that was being ordered to make the payment, perhaps the Bruges merchant's own trusted banking agent located in Venice. Finally, it would specify when the payment was to be made, often a set number of days in the future, such as 90 days after the bill was presented. The document would then be signed by the Bruges merchant, their signature acting as a personal guarantee of the funds. This simple, handwritten note was a complete, self-contained contract. It was a clear and unambiguous instruction, a written promise that transformed an abstract debt into a tangible, transferable object. This piece of paper, containing only names, dates, a sum, and a signature, held the full authority of the merchant who issued it. It was the quiet beginning of a system where the promise to pay could travel more safely and easily than the payment itself. Once the bill of exchange was written and signed, it was entrusted to a courier for the long journey to its destination. For the recipient, this single sheet of paper was now a valuable and versatile financial tool. It represented a secure promise of future payment, but its usefulness did not end there. Let's return to our Venetian silk trader. Upon receiving the bill from Bruges, they now held a formal promise for 1,000 ducats, payable in 90 days. The 90-day period itself was a form of credit, allowing the Bruges merchant time to sell the silk before the payment was due. The Venetian trader had a choice. They could simply hold the document for the full term and, on the appointed day, present it to the designated banker in Venice to receive their coins. This was the simplest path. However, the silk trader also had their own local business to conduct and their own debts to settle. Perhaps they owed money to a supplier of fine dyes. Instead of waiting for the 90 days to pass, they could use the bill of exchange itself as a form of payment. By signing the back of the document, a quiet and simple process called an endorsement, they could transfer the right to that future payment to their dye supplier. The dye supplier now held the promise. This person could, in turn, hold it until the payment date, or endorse it once more to pay their own creditor. In this way, the bill of exchange could circulate within the local merchant community of Venice, a quiet and convenient substitute for coin. It was both a promise of a future long-distance settlement and a means for making immediate local payments. This elegant system allowed a single debt from a far-off city to settle a chain of local debts, all without a single duco having to be counted out until the final day of settlement arrived. The bill of exchange was a truly elegant solution, transforming the perilous journey of gold into the quiet and safe passage of a single sheet of paper. It allowed value to move across vast distances through a simple, coordinated process, built upon the trust placed in the great banking houses and their international networks. Let's follow a single transaction to see how it worked. A cloth merchant in London needs to pay a supplier in Florence for a shipment of fine textiles. Instead of loading a chest with gold, the merchant visits the London branch of a Florentine bank. There, they deposit the required sum in English pounds sterling. In return, the London banker provides them with a bill of exchange. This is a formal, handwritten order addressed to their own head office in Florence. It instructs the Florence bank to pay the textile supplier a specific amount in the local currency, golden florins. This lightweight document is then sent to Florence by a courier. It is a much smaller and less tempting target than a chest of coins. Upon its arrival, the supplier presents the bill at the bank in Florence. The Florentine banker verifies the document, checks it against their own records, and then pays the supplier the full amount in florins, directly from their own vaults. The payment has been completed, yet no physical gold has crossed the English Channel or the Alps. The London merchant paid in their local currency, and the Florentine supplier received payment in theirs. The two branches of the bank, in London and Florence, would later settle the accounts between themselves, a simple matter of adjusting the entries in their corresponding ledgers. This quiet, paper-based system replaced the physical risk of the road with the institutional trust of the bank. It was a network of information where a promise written in London could be reliably honored in Florence. This innovation made the world of commerce feel both safer and much smaller, connecting distant markets through the calm and orderly exchange of paper. The elegant efficiency of the bill of exchange was made possible by a quiet, coordinated dance between four distinct parties. Each had a specific and simple role to play, and together they formed a closed and self-balancing system that allowed international trade to function with a new level of safety and ease. The process would begin with the first party, a merchant in one city, let's say London, who needed to make a payment. This merchant was the buyer. Their role was to initiate the transaction by going to their local banker. The second party was the buyer's banker, in this case the banker in London. This banker would accept the payment from the merchant in the local currency of pounds sterling. They would then draft and issue the bill of exchange, which was their formal, written instruction to their counterpart in another city. The third party was the person to be paid, the seller of the goods, located in the distant city, let's say Florence. Their role was to receive the bill of exchange, sent safely by courier, and to hold it as a secure promise of payment. The fourth and final party was the banker in the seller's city, the correspondent bank in Florence. This banker was the one who received the instruction written on the bill. When the seller from Florence presented the document, This banker's role was to honor it, paying out the specified amount in the local currency of Florence. In this four-cornered arrangement, the two merchants never had to interact directly with the other's currency or bank, and the two banking houses took on the quiet administrative task of settling the debt between themselves, often at a later date, by balancing the many bills of exchange that flowed in both directions. It was a complete and contained transaction, linking a buyer, a seller, and their two respective bankers. This simple structure distributed the trust in the work, making the entire system both resilient and remarkably efficient. To see this system in motion, we can follow the quiet journey of a single, routine transaction, one that might have happened hundreds of times a year. Let us imagine a Florentine cloth weaver who needs a steady supply of the fine, raw wool that comes from England. The wool itself would make the long and uncertain journey by sea. The payment, however, would travel by a different and much safer path. The Florentine weaver would begin by visiting his local banking house. He would deposit the required amount of money in his own currency, the golden florins of Florence. The banker, after carefully recording the deposit in his ledger, would then prepare the bill of exchange. At a heavy wooden desk, a clerk would take a sheet of paper and, with a quill pen, write out a formal instruction. The note would be addressed to the bank's own trusted branch manager in London. It would order the London branch to pay the English wool merchant a specific sum in the local currency, pounds sterling, typically 90 days after the bill was presented. This single, signed document would then be sealed and given to a courier. The courier's journey over the Alps and across the English Channel was far faster and safer than that of a guarded caravan carrying a heavy chest of gold. When the bill arrived in London, it would be delivered to the English wool merchant. For him, this paper was as good as the payment itself. He knew he could take it to the London office of the Florentine Bank, a familiar and reputable establishment in his own city. On the agreed-upon date, the merchant would present the bill. The London banker would verify the signature and the instruction, then pay the wool merchant the full amount in pounds sterling from his own reserves. The transaction was now complete. The wool had been paid for, and the debt was settled. Through this methodical process, the value had moved from Florence to London, yet the physical gold of each city remained securely in its own respective vault. The entire system of the bill of exchange depended on one crucial and steady element: the presence of a trusted banking agent in the destination city. This individual, or branch office, was the final and most important link in the chain. The quiet authority that transformed a piece of paper from a distant land into real, spendable local currency. When our English wool merchant arrived at the London office of the Florentine Bank, they would be met not by a stranger, but by a known figure in the local commercial world. The process that followed was one of established and reassuring routine. The merchant would present the bill of exchange. The banking agent would take the document and examine it with a practiced eye. They would check the signature against samples they kept on file, verify the date, and ensure any seals were intact. They might also consult their own incoming correspondence, checking the bill's details against a list of approved payments sent ahead by the head office in Florence. Once satisfied that the document was genuine, the agent would turn to their own strongbox or account books. Using local pounds sterling from their own reserves, they would carefully count out the required sum and provide it to the merchant. The final step was to make a meticulous entry in their own ledger, recording that they had fulfilled the instruction and that the head office in Florence now owed their branch a debt. In this quiet transaction, the banking agent acted as the local representative of a foreign bank's promise. They used their own capital to honor a commitment made hundreds of miles away, confident that their own bank's internal accounting system would eventually balance the books. Their role was to provide the final, physical fulfillment of the bill, to turn the abstract promise into tangible value. This local presence was the bedrock of the system's reliability, the steady anchor that made the entire international network function with predictable calm. In the developing world of medieval finance, the activities of merchants and bankers had to align with the deeply held social and religious beliefs of the time. One of the most significant of these was the view on usury. Usury, in its simplest form, was the practice of charging interest for the lending of money. and for many centuries this was considered a deeply improper activity. The reasoning behind this view was based on a quiet and widely understood idea about the nature of money itself. Gold and silver coins were seen as a sterile or barren medium. They were a tool for measuring value and exchanging goods. But unlike a seed planted in a field or livestock in a pasture, a coin could not naturally grow or reproduce. It was simply an inert piece of metal. Therefore, to lend a sum of money and demand back a greater amount was seen as creating a profit from something that was not inherently productive. It was, in a sense, seen as selling the passage of time, which was not considered something a person could own or charge for. A clear distinction was often made between this kind of loan and other forms of investment. Renting out a piece of land was acceptable because the land itself produced a tangible harvest. Loaning a tool or a draft animal was also acceptable because these things helped create new value. A simple loan of money, however, especially to someone in need, was viewed differently. It was seen as profiting directly from another person's need or misfortune, rather than sharing in the risk and reward of a productive venture. And so, the simple act of charging interest was surrounded by a strong sense of moral caution. This prevailing view meant that the world of commerce, which depended on the movement and lending of capital, needed to find ways to structure its financial arrangements that were both practical and acceptable within this framework of belief. Faced with the strong prohibitions against charging interest, the inventive world of medieval commerce developed a set of quiet and sophisticated techniques to make a profit from lending, without ever explicitly naming it as such. These were not deceptive tricks, but widely understood and accepted financial arrangements, structured in a way that aligned with the principles of the time. The bill of exchange proved to be a particularly flexible tool for this purpose. One of the most common methods was to embed the cost of the loan within the currency exchange rate itself. Let us return to our Florentine merchant buying wool from London. When he purchases his bill of exchange, it will be in order for the London office to pay out in pounds sterling. The Florentine bank, however, will charge him for this bill in golden florins. The exchange rate they offer for this transaction would not be the simple direct rate of the day. Instead, it would be a slightly less favorable future rate. This small, calculated difference between the current value of the currencies and the rate charged for the future payment was not called interest. It was simply the banker's fee, a compensation for the service and the risk of currency fluctuations over the 90-day period. Another accepted practice was to charge a fee for a late payment. If a borrower could not repay a loan by the agreed-upon date, a penalty could be added. This was not seen as interest on the original loan, but as a legitimate compensation to the lender for the damages caused by the delay. These methods allowed the financial system to function and grow. Bankers could earn a return on their capital, not by charging a direct fee for the use of money, but by providing valuable services like currency exchange, or by being compensated for risk and inconvenience. It was a subtle reframing of the transaction, a quiet shift in language that allowed the essential functions of credit and lending to continue, all while remaining within the accepted moral framework of the age. The bill of exchange was not only a tool for payment, but also a remarkably subtle instrument of credit. Within its simple handwritten lines, bankers found a way to earn a profit on their services, a fee that functioned much like interest, but was structured in a way that was entirely consistent with the customs of the time. This was achieved through the careful and deliberate manipulation of two key variables, the currency exchange rate and time. The process was a quiet and routine calculation, built into the very first step of the transaction. When a merchant came to a bank to purchase a bill of exchange, they were essentially buying a future payment in a foreign currency. The banker would not offer them the current, on-the-spot exchange rate for this transaction. Instead, they would consult their tables and provide a specific, predetermined rate for a payment to be made in, for example, 90 days. This future exchange rate would be slightly different from the present one. This difference was the key. The small margin built into the future rate was the banker's compensation. It was not called interest. It was presented as a fee for the banker's service, a charge that covered the risk they were taking that the real exchange rate might change unfavorably over the next 3 months. It was also a fee for the convenience of not having to ship physical gold. To the merchant, this was a perfectly reasonable and practical arrangement. They were paying for a valuable service that made their business safer and more efficient. In this way, the profit was not an additional charge but was woven directly into the fabric of the transaction itself. It was the quiet space between two different numbers on the banker's chart, the value of a florin today, and its agreed-upon value against a pound sterling 90 days from now. This elegant method allowed credit to be extended and compensated, powering the engine of commerce through a system of understood fees rather than direct interest. These financial practices were not viewed as a hidden deception. Instead, they became a quiet, understood part of the commercial landscape, accepted by merchants and bankers alike because they were, above all else, immensely practical. The system worked, and it allowed international trade to flourish in a way that would have otherwise been impossible. For the international merchant, these instruments were a matter of practical necessity. The alternative, shipping chests of physical gold, was fraught with risk and inefficiency. When a merchant considered the arrangement offered by the bank, the logic was clear and compelling. The small, predictable fee embedded in the exchange rate was a known cost, one that could be easily factored into the price of their goods. This cost was far preferable to the immense and unpredictable risk of a lost shipment, or the long delays that came with moving heavy coins across the continent. The transaction was framed not as a loan of money, but as the purchase of a valuable service. The merchant was paying for the banker's expertise in foreign currencies, for their assumption of the risk of exchange rate fluctuations, and for the use of their trusted international network. It was a fee for convenience and security. This was a distinction that was well understood within the merchant community. It was a routine cost of doing business, no different from paying for shipping, warehousing, or insurance. In short, these methods were quietly accepted because they provided a solution to a real and persistent problem. They were seen not as a way to bend the rules, but as a fair and logical arrangement that benefited everyone involved. The system was a practical response to the demands of a growing economy. This quiet consensus, this shared understanding of how things worked, allowed the bill of exchange to become the standard, indispensable tool for settling accounts across borders, forming the very backbone of international commerce. The success of a single banking house depended on its own internal network of branches, but for the entire system of international commerce to function smoothly, a wider web of cooperation was needed. And so, the great banking houses began to create a quiet, trusted network among themselves, agreeing to honor each other's credit across the continent. This system was a practical solution to a simple problem. No single bank could afford to have a branch in every important trading town. A bank in Florence might have a strong presence in London, but what if a client needed to pay a supplier in the city of Hamburg? The solution was to form a partnership with a reputable independent banking house in Hamburg. This was not a merger, but a formal, correspondent relationship, built upon a foundation of mutual respect and a shared understanding of sound business practices. The process of establishing this relationship was a careful and deliberate one. The two banks would exchange letters and perhaps even place deposits with one another as a sign of good faith. Once the agreement was in place, they could begin to act as agents for each other. The Florentine bank could now issue a bill of exchange, instructing their partner in Hamburg to pay a local merchant. The Hamburg banker would honor this request without hesitation. They would make the payment from their own funds, confident in the knowledge that the Florentine bank was good for the debt. The two banks would keep a running account of these transactions in their ledgers. Over time, the flow of payments would often go in both directions, allowing them to settle their accounts by simply balancing the books. This web of correspondent banks meant that a merchant's financial reach was no longer limited to the branches of their own institution. Through this quiet and methodical cooperation, the banking houses of Europe effectively created a single, continent-wide financial network, knitting together the world of trade with invisible threads of reciprocal trust. While the day-to-day business of banking took place in the quiet counting houses of Europe's cities, there were certain times and places where the entire financial community would converge. Among the most important of these were the great champagne fairs in France. These were sprawling, seasonal markets where merchants from all over Europe gathered to trade goods. But they were also something more. They were the central clearinghouses for international finance. The fairs provided a rare and valuable opportunity for bankers and their agents to meet face-to-face. A banker from Genoa could sit down at a table with a banker from Bruges and, in the course of a single afternoon, settle months of accumulated transactions. They would bring with them their ledgers and the stacks of bills of exchange that had been paid out on each other's behalf. The process was a methodical one of reconciliation. They would go through the bills one by one, verifying the amounts and totaling the debits and credits that had built up between them. This process dramatically reduced the need for physical gold to be moved. Let's imagine that over the past season, the Genoese bank had paid out 10,000 florins on behalf of the Bruges bank. At the same time, the Bruges bank had paid out 9,000 florins on behalf of the Genoese bank. Instead of two large shipments of gold crossing the Alps, the two bankers could simply settle the difference. The Bruges banker would pay the Genoese banker the net amount of 1,000 florins, and their entire account would be balanced. These fairs, with their bustling crowds and rows of merchant stalls, were the quiet heart of the European financial system. They were the physical place where the abstract debts recorded in ledgers hundreds of miles apart were brought together and resolved. This regular, face-to-face settlement was a crucial piece of the puzzle, allowing the entire network of correspondent banking to function with confidence and efficiency. While the bill of exchange was designed for the great distances of international trade, a much simpler, quieter form of payment was needed for the everyday commerce within a single city. A transaction between two merchants whose workshops were on the same street did not require a complex financial instrument. It required a simple local solution, and the banking houses provided one through a direct written instruction. This instrument, a precursor to the modern check, was a model of simplicity. Let's imagine a tailor who has purchased a large quantity of thread from a local supplier. Both the tailor and the supplier keep their money with the same Florentine bank. To settle the debt, the tailor would not need to withdraw a heavy bag of coins. Instead, they would sit at their desk and write a brief, formal note addressed directly to their banker. The instruction would be clear and unambiguous. It would state the date, the name of the thread supplier, the exact sum to be paid, and a simple phrase like, "Please charge this to my account." The note would then be signed by the tailor, their signature serving as the authorization. The tailor would then give this signed note to the thread supplier. The supplier would take the short walk to the bank and present the piece of paper to a clerk. The clerk's work was a quiet and familiar routine. They would first verify that the signature on the note matched the one they had on file for the tailor. Once confirmed, the clerk would open the bank's large, heavy ledger. No coins would change hands. Instead, the clerk would turn to the tailor's page and make a debit entry, subtracting the specified amount. Then, they would turn to the thread supplier's page and make a corresponding credit entry, adding the exact same sum. The payment was complete. The entire transaction had taken place as a silent, methodical transfer of figures within the bank's own book. It was a perfectly efficient system, relying on the bank's central role as the trusted keeper of records. This simple handwritten order was a powerful tool, allowing the daily business of the city to be conducted with a new level of ease and security. The widespread use of these simple written instructions brought about a quiet but fundamental change in the city's economic rhythm. As more and more merchants and artisans began to keep their funds with the same few banking houses, a new reality emerged. The daily flow of commerce no longer needed to be accompanied by the constant clinking and weighing of coins. On any given day, a stream of these signed notes would arrive at the bank. The clerk's work was a steady, methodical process of turning pages in the great ledger. A debit would be entered on the page of a baker paying for flour. A corresponding credit would appear on the page of the grain miller. A carpenter would pay a lumber merchant. A weaver would pay a dyer. This whole complex dance of economic activity, the settling of dozens of small debts, was accomplished with the gentle scratch of a quill on paper. All the while, the physical gold and silver coins they represented might sit, undisturbed, in the cool, dark stillness of the bank's secure vault. The money, in a very real sense, was now living in the book. the ledger entries themselves became the primary medium of exchange. The physical coins were the anchor, the quiet underlying guarantee of value that gave everyone confidence in the system, but they were no longer needed for the transaction itself. This dramatically reduced the daily need for coinage, which in turn reduced the wear and tear on the coins themselves and lessened the risk of carrying money through the city streets. In simple terms, the bank's ledger had become a centralized clearinghouse for the city's economy. This system of book entry payments allowed value to be transferred with the speed and ease of writing a note. It was a more abstract, but far more efficient form of money. This quiet shift, from a system based on physical objects to one based on trusted records, was a crucial step in the ongoing evolution of finance. In the great trading city of Genoa, a new and different kind of financial institution began to take shape. It was not a private bank, owned and operated by a single wealthy family, but something more public and permanent. This institution was the Casa di San Giorgio, the Bank of St. George, and its structure represented a quiet but significant evolution in the world of finance. Its origins were practical, born from the financial needs of the city itself. Over many years, the Republic of Genoa had borrowed heavily from its own wealthy citizens to fund its navy, its wars, and its civic projects. This public debt grew into a complex collection of many different loans. To manage this, a new body was created. The city's creditors, the people who had lent it money, were brought together, and their individual loans were consolidated into shares in this new bank. In return for the money they had lent the state, they now owned a piece of the Casa di San Giorgio. The bank was then given a crucial and steady source of income, the right to collect certain city taxes. The revenue from these taxes was not used for the city's general expenses, but was directed to the bank. The bank, in turn, used these funds to make regular, predictable payments known as dividends to its shareholders. It was a self-sustaining system, a formal partnership between the state and its financiers. In essence, the Bank of St. George was an institution created to manage the public debt. The city's lenders became the bank's owners, and the city's tax revenues became the source of their return. It was a highly organized arrangement that transformed Genoa's scattered debts into a single, stable financial entity. This quiet innovation, a bank that was both a private enterprise and a public utility, would serve as a durable model for the future of state finance. The establishment of institutions like the Bank of St. George marked a quiet but profound shift in the landscape of finance. It signaled a slow movement away from a world dominated entirely by private, family-run banking houses, toward the creation of more formal, public, and permanent financial bodies. This was not a sudden change, but a gradual evolution driven by the growing scale and complexity of the economy. Private family banks, for all their success, had an inherent vulnerability. Their fortunes were deeply tied to the skills, wisdom, and even the health of a few key individuals. A change in leadership from one generation to the next, a series of poor decisions, or a single disastrous loan to an unreliable monarch could bring the entire enterprise to a halt. Their existence was, in a sense, as mortal as the family that ran them. Public banking institutions, by contrast, were designed for a different kind of longevity. Their structure was not dependent on a single family line. They were governed by a board of directors, often elected by the shareholders, and managed by professional administrators. This created a continuity of purpose that could outlast any one individual. The institution itself, with its formal rules and its deep integration with the state, was built to endure. Its purpose was not just the enrichment of a single family, but the stable management of the public's finances. This shift was a response to the growing need for a financial system that was as stable and enduring as the state itself. As governments and commerce grew larger, they required a financial partner with a longer time horizon and a broader, more impersonal foundation of trust. The move from the private counting house to the formal public bank was a logical step in building a financial infrastructure that was more resilient, more predictable, and capable of supporting the long-term needs of a modernizing economy. As the city of Amsterdam grew into one of the world's most important centers of commerce, its very success created a practical and persistent problem. The harbor was a constant flurry of activity, with ships arriving daily from every corner of the known world. Each of these ships brought with it not only goods, but also the currency of its home port. The result was that the city's marketplace was flooded with a bewildering variety of gold and silver coins. There were Spanish pieces of 8, German thalers, French écus, and dozens of others, all circulating side by side. This created a quiet, low-level chaos for merchants. Many of the coins were worn down from years of handling, and some had been deliberately clipped, reducing their metallic content. It was difficult to know the true value of any given payment without a slow and painstaking process of weighing and assessment for every single transaction. To bring order to this situation, the city established the Bank of Amsterdam in the early 17th century. Its purpose was simple: to create a single, reliable currency for all major business dealings. The bank's method was a model of methodical calm. A merchant would bring their sack of mixed real-world coins to the bank. Expert clerks employed by the city would carefully test and weigh each coin, determining its precise value in pure silver. The total value would then be credited to the merchant's account in a new, perfectly stable unit of account called the bank florin. This bank florin was not a physical coin. It was a credit in the bank's official ledger, a guaranteed and unchanging measure of value. The city then decreed that all commercial bills over a certain amount had to be paid through the bank. Payments were made not by handing over coins, but by a simple, written instruction to the bank to transfer a certain number of bank florins from one merchant's account to another. In this way, the Bank of Amsterdam took the chaotic jumble of real-world money and transformed it into a single, uniform, and utterly dependable system of payment, bringing a new sense of quiet order and predictability to the bustling port. The bank florin, this new form of money that existed only as an entry in a ledger, quickly became the most trusted currency in international trade. It was known as bank money, and its value came from its perfect and unwavering reliability. A physical coin circulating in the marketplace was a thing of uncertainty. Its value could be diminished by wear or by the clipping of its edges. But a bank florin was an abstract concept, a fixed and guaranteed measure of a specific weight of pure silver, its value protected from the physical decay of the real world. The Bank of Amsterdam maintained this trust through a simple and powerful promise. It held 100% of the physical coins that had been deposited. It did not lend this money out. This meant that for every single bank florin recorded in its ledgers, there was a corresponding and verifiable amount of real gold or silver sitting securely in its vaults. This full backing gave the bank money an unmatched reputation for safety. Merchants across Europe understood that a credit at the Bank of Amsterdam was not just a promise. It was a direct, guaranteed claim on a real, physical asset. Because of this absolute reliability, the bank florin was always valued slightly more than the physical currency circulating on the streets outside. This small premium was the price of certainty. For a merchant in a distant port arranging a large transaction, the preference was clear. They would rather receive payment in the form of a stable, predictable credit of bank money than in a heavy shipment of assorted coins of uncertain quality. In essence, the Bank of Amsterdam had created a perfect currency, one that existed only as information in a trusted book. This, bank money, provided a stable common ground for international commerce. It was a universally understood unit of account, allowing merchants from different lands to trade with a new level of confidence, all based on the quiet, methodical work of the clerks and the silent, untouched reserves in the vault. As the 17th century drew to a close, the financial needs of the English government had become more complex. Raising money for public projects and funding the state's activities had long relied on short-term, often expensive loans from individual financiers. This method was unpredictable. A more permanent and stable system was needed. It was in this quiet context of administrative necessity that a new institution, the Bank of England, was proposed and established. The foundation of the bank was a single, large-scale transaction. A charter was offered to a group of private investors who would subscribe to a loan for the government of £1.2 million. This entire sum was lent directly to the state. In exchange, the government would pay the subscribers a steady annual interest, an income stream secured by specific new taxes on shipping and alcohol. These investors were then incorporated as a formal bank. Crucially, they were also granted the privilege of issuing their own banknotes up to the value of the government loan. These early notes were simple, handwritten documents, promises from the bank to pay the bearer a certain sum in coin on demand. They were, in effect, a new form of paper money, backed by the security of the government's own debt. In essence, the Bank of England was created to perform one central function: to be the government's primary creditor and financial agent. It transformed the nation's debt from a collection of temporary, high-cost loans into a single, permanent, and manageable fund. It was a formal partnership, linking the security of the state with the capital of private citizens. This new arrangement brought a quiet predictability to the state's finances. The government now had a reliable partner to turn to, and the existence of a permanent national debt managed by a stable institution created a new and trusted asset for the financial community. It was a foundational step in building the modern system of public finance. Beyond its primary role as the government's banker, the Bank of England gradually began to assume a new and quieter responsibility. It started to function as the steady center of the country's entire financial system, a source of stability for all the other banks operating in London and beyond. This stabilizing influence came from a few key, routine functions. First, many of the smaller private banks found it convenient and safe to keep some of their own reserves, their holdings of gold and silver, on deposit with the much larger and more secure Bank of England. This turned the bank into a banker's bank, the central repository for the nation's cash reserves. This quiet consolidation of funds created a large, central pool of liquidity that could be drawn upon when needed. Second, when one of these smaller banks faced a difficult period, perhaps a sudden and unexpected demand for withdrawals, this central pool became a crucial lifeline. The small bank, if it was otherwise sound, could go to the Bank of England and borrow the cash it needed to meet the demand. This was not a regular occurrence, but a measure for unusual circumstances. This ability to provide emergency support acted as a quiet, dependable backstop, preventing a temporary problem at one bank from spreading and causing wider uncertainty. Finally, the banknotes issued by the Bank of England, being so reliable and widely accepted, became the standard paper currency for the whole country. This created a uniform and predictable monetary environment, simplifying transactions for everyone. So the Bank of England became the steady anchor of the financial world. By holding the ultimate reserves for other banks, by providing liquidity in times of need, and by issuing a trustworthy national currency, it created a more predictable and resilient system. These quiet background operations help to foster the deep confidence that is so essential for the smooth functioning of any economy. As the number of banks in a city like London grew, a new layer of complexity emerged. Every day, each bank would receive a multitude of written instructions, checks, drawn on the accounts of many other different banks. In the early days, settling these payments was a slow and cumbersome physical process. A clerk from each bank, known as a walk clerk, would have to spend their entire day walking from one bank to another, presenting the checks they had received and collecting the corresponding amount in coin. This constant movement of clerks and heavy bags of gold through the city streets was inefficient and carried obvious risks. It became clear that a more organized system was needed, a central place where all these interbank debts could be settled at once. This practical need led to the organic development of the clearinghouse. The story goes that the walk clerks themselves, tired of their daily rounds, began to meet informally at a coffee house. There, sitting around a table, they would simply exchange their bundles of checks and work out the net amounts owed. This informal gathering soon evolved into a formal institution. The banks established a dedicated space, a clearinghouse, where a clerk from each member institution would meet at a set time each day. The process was a model of quiet efficiency. Each clerk would arrive with a parcel containing all the checks their bank had received that were drawn on the other member banks. They would sort the checks and present each bank with the bundle intended for them. At the end of this exchange, a grand tally would be made. Each bank's clerk would calculate their total debits, the sum of all the checks drawn on their own bank, and their total credits. the sum of all the checks they had presented to others. The entire day's transactions for the whole city could then be resolved. This methodical, centralized process was a simple but powerful innovation. The establishment of the clearinghouse brought a new and profound efficiency to the entire banking system. The true innovation was not just the central meeting place, but the quiet, mathematical process of settlement that took place there. It was a system that dramatically reduced the need for physical money to be moved around the city. At the end of the daily exchange of checks, the clerk for each bank would have a clear picture of their position. For example, a clerk from one bank might find that they held checks totaling £10,000 drawn on other banks. At the same time, the other banks held checks totaling £9,000 drawn on his own bank. In the old system, this would have required his bank to collect £10,000 in cash while also paying out £9,000. It would have been a day of many separate, cumbersome transactions. The clearinghouse replaced all of this with a single, simple calculation. The clerk's position was calculated as a net figure. In our example, the bank was owed £10,000 and it owed £9,000. Therefore, its net position was that it was owed £1,000. Another bank might find that its debits and credits resulted in a net amount owed of £500. Once these final net balances were calculated for every bank, the settlement was a simple matter. Instead of bags of gold, the final payments were often made through a simple transfer between the accounts that each member bank held at the Central Bank of England. The bank that owed £500 would simply instruct the Bank of England to move that amount from its account to the clearinghouse account. The bank that was owed £1,000 would receive a credit for that amount. In this way, millions of pounds worth of transactions could be settled with only a few £1,000s of actual transfers. The clearinghouse, through this quiet daily ritual of netting accounts, transformed the payment system. It replaced a vast, inefficient web of physical movements with a single, elegant accounting process, making the entire network of payments more fluid, more secure, and almost silent. The simple, handwritten bill of exchange was more than just a clever solution to a medieval problem. It was the quiet introduction of a set of fundamental ideas, a conceptual blueprint that would continue to shape the world of finance for centuries to come. The principles it established laid the essential groundwork for the vast and complex global payment systems we know today. The first and most powerful of these ideas was the separation of the payment instruction from the physical currency. The bill of exchange proved that value could be moved across great distances simply by moving a trusted piece of information. This concept of abstract value, a promise traveling in place of gold, is the direct ancestor of every electronic fund transfer. The second core principle was the reliance on a network of trusted intermediaries. The system only worked because a banker in Florence and a banker in London had a formal relationship, agreeing to honor each other's instructions. This is the foundational logic of correspondent banking and the international networks that connect financial institutions across borders. Finally, the Bill of Exchange demonstrated the power of a shared, standardized format. Its predictable structure, names, dates, sums, created a universal language for credit, allowing it to be understood and accepted across different cultures and legal systems. In essence, this early instrument established three pillars that remain central to finance. It showed that money could be represented by information. It proved that this information could be moved securely through a network of trusted agents. And it created a standardized framework for these transactions. The technology has changed from quill pens and couriers on horseback to fiber optics and encrypted data, but these underlying principles have remained remarkably constant. The legacy of this quiet innovation is all around us. The calm, methodical logic of the Bill of Exchange, a signed instruction honored by a distant partner, is still echoed in the silent, near-instantaneous movement of funds across the globe. The tools are unimaginably faster, but the foundational idea of moving a promise instead of a coin is a direct inheritance from the world of the medieval merchant. The heavy, leather-bound ledger, with its neat columns ruled in ink, may seem like an object from a distant past, and yet its fundamental logic has not vanished. It has simply changed its form, its principles now embedded deep within the silent digital heart of modern finance and accounting. The elegant symmetry of double-entry bookkeeping, The idea that every transaction has two equal and opposite effects remains the unshakable foundation of our entire financial world. When we make a purchase today, a complex series of events happens in an instant. A credit is recorded as value leaves one account, and a corresponding debit is made as that same value arrives in another. Our modern software and vast computer networks are built to enforce this simple, centuries-old rule with perfect fidelity. For every credit, there must be a debit. The books must always balance. The modern accounting database is, in essence, a direct descendant of the Florentine ledger. It is simply a faster, more expansive, and more meticulous clerk. It performs the same ritual of balancing with every single transaction, from the smallest online purchase to the largest corporate merger. This system provides the same quiet confidence it always has, the certainty that the financial record is complete, accurate, and internally consistent. The digital system will not allow a one-sided entry, preserving the same integrity that was once the responsibility of a clerk with a quill pen. In this way, the core principle of the ledger endures. This method of creating a self-checking, balanced record of every financial event is just as vital today as it was in the counting houses of the Renaissance. The tools have changed from quill and ink to silicon and light, but the quiet, foundational logic of the balanced book remains exactly the same. It is a testament to the power of a simple, orderly idea, a system of quiet symmetry that continues to bring a sense of predictable calm to the complex flow of the modern economy. The world of banking did not appear fully formed. It grew slowly, piece by piece, out of a series of simple, practical needs faced by the merchants and traders who were reawakening the pathways of commerce. The entire complex system we have explored began with the most basic requirement of all: a safe place to keep one's money. The early answer was the money changer's bench, the banca, a physical service in the open marketplace. This evolved into the strong vault of the banking house, a place of quiet security. But simple safekeeping was not enough. As the volume of transactions grew, a reliable memory was needed, a way to track the steady flow of funds. This led to the quiet discipline of the ledger and the elegant, self-balancing logic of double-entry bookkeeping. The bank was no longer just a vault. It was a meticulous and trusted record-keeper. Yet even a perfect local record could not solve the greatest challenge: the vast and often perilous distances between cities. The need to settle accounts between a merchant in London and a supplier in Florence, without the risk of shipping heavy chests of gold, called for a new idea. And so, from this need for a safer and more efficient way to pay, the bill of exchange was born. This simple piece of paper transformed a physical problem into a matter of information and trust. Each of these steps was a logical extension of the last. The ledger brought order to the vault. The bill of exchange extended the logic of the ledger across borders. These were not grand theories, but quiet, methodical responses to the everyday problems of commerce. And so, from the simple act of guarding a coin, to the meticulous balancing of a book, and finally to the trusted passage of a written promise, the foundational elements of modern finance were slowly put into place. It was a gradual and quiet construction, built one necessary solution at a time. The story of early banking is, at its heart, a story about the quiet power of trust. It is not a tale of grand events or sudden discoveries, but of the slow, methodical construction of a reliable system. At every stage, from the public bench of the money changer to the private counting rooms of the great Florentine houses, the most valuable asset was not the gold in the vault, but the simple, unwavering confidence that a promise, once written and signed, would be kept. This trust was built upon a visible foundation of order. The meticulous, balanced ledger, with its neat columns of debits and credits, was more than just a record-keeping tool. It was an instrument of clarity and calm in a world of complex and uncertain commerce. It provided a verifiable, impartial truth that merchants, partners, and clients could all rely upon. This quiet daily ritual of balancing the books, performed with a steady hand by diligent clerks, was the consistent, rhythmic heartbeat of the entire system. And upon this dual foundation of trust and order, a new and powerful idea could be built. The idea that money itself could become something more abstract. The bill of exchange transformed value from a heavy physical substance into a lightweight, transferable piece of information. The book entry payment took this a step further, allowing the commerce of an entire city to flow through the silent, invisible movement of numbers within a single, trusted book. This gradual shift, from the tangible coin to the abstract entry, was what allowed the world of trade to grow far beyond its previous physical limitations. These foundational principles of trust in a good name, of order in a balanced book, and of the abstraction of value have remained with us. They are the quiet, unseen architecture that supports the structure of our modern financial world. The tools and the speed have changed beyond recognition, but the underlying need for a trusted, orderly system to manage our economic lives is a constant. The quiet work of the early bankers in creating these simple systems of reliability was a profound and enduring contribution, a steady foundation upon which so much else could be built.